This is Culture Script 6, and these next two videos may turn out to be a little lengthy. I think I alerted you very early on that complex problems require complex solutions, and I can't just give you Band-Aid therapy in addressing the need to intervene and to change our culture, our very natures, and to help us establish more firmly the culture of godliness in the world, and also the society of Zion, and how to do this in one life at a time, how to intervene and help them productively exercise their free agency in order to discover truth for themselves at a level that they can comprehend. So that's not simple. If it was, the world would not be in the mess it's in. Please be aware of that. You know, we got to stop what they say, hey, let's do everything the way we've always done it, but this time let's expect different results. If we try that, we're going to be putting off the coming of the Savior, the beginning of the millennium, day by day, month by month, year by year. Until we get it right, it won't happen, because we're supposed to learn all of these things. As I've said before, I don't have a magic bullet, but there's an awful lot of information already out there to help us format our minds so that we can think through these things carefully. Well, right now, we're dealing with culture in which everything else is encapsulated. It's all, everything going on around us is part of culture. And so we got to get it right. We got to get the bones and the foundation laid for understanding culture so that all the other knowledge and knowledge domains and other things have a place to fit. So that's what we're doing. And I'm launching in now to Hall's model of culture. And that's Edward T. Hall, who wrote the book, The Silent Language, where he shows that culture is communication. And I'm giving you a website address where you can pick up that book. And I would strongly suggest that you read it for your own information. Because if you're going to try to craft masterful interventions, you'll need to know these things. And more now, I'm going to be depending on the fact that you have read the material that we've been talking about in the study guide. You're not just trying to cherry pick a few things off these videos and make a philosophy for how you're going to create an intervention. That doesn't work. It just doesn't. I introduced you to the literate practices very early so that you have research tools just in case you're not a professional scholar or student. It's a very simple process, but it has great power and will allow you to study these things, codify them, get them outlined, and then be able to pull them up in your mind and work them over and discover the insights that will best serve you. And it gives the Lord some basis for giving you additional light knowledge, see, because you will have prepared yourself to be able to receive and understand it. I'm not trying to lecture you, I'm just sharing with you what my understanding is of the environment or the climate in which we've got to do our work. Okay, now, the reason I did this last little bit is because you're going to start hearing words that I have tried to prepare you to understand in advance by defining them. But if you haven't done your homework, these words may not mean anything to you, or they may not have their full value. So be alert. And if things start going past you, just take that as a sign that you need to do some research back through the videos or back through the study guide until you get a proper definition of these words for yourselves. Now, with my script, this is the first thing I'm starting with. It says these alternatives, the word itself and its functional meaning are the same as found in Smith, Stanley, and Shor's model. In other words, this word alternatives has a great use not only for Smith, Stanley, and Shor's, but also for Hall. And that's what we're going to find, is that some of these words transfer over. Some have to be defined a little differently. Anyway, this is what he's saying. A proper cultural analysis has to begin with a microcultural analysis on the isolate level once the sets have been perceived. So we're going to start talking with the words that he uses, like isolates and sets and patterns, which could turn out to be one of the more important principles that you ever learn, is how to be aware that there are patterns and how to do a cultural analysis to find out what they are and how they're working. So that's where we're going. I'm going to give you some examples of this. I mentioned before that I'm inculcated in 2 different cultures, and so I'll just use cross-cultural illustrations to help you see what a pattern is, how it works, and that might set you up so that you could do it. Okay, now continuing, it says, to me, sets are behaviors linked together in a chain, like a greeting ritual including a handshake. And we certainly have our greeting rituals. A lot of us, it's a hug rather than a handshake anymore. But anyway, we observe the sets of the behavior. They walk up, they stick out their hand, they grasp your hand, they shake it up and down, and so on. And I think you already know that sometimes there's a thing called a Mormon handshake. And when it's all over, you have to almost count your fingers, because some Mormons give very, very firm and enthusiastic handshakes. Anyway, we observe these things, and then we assign meaning to a group of sets. When we assign a meaning to a group of sets, we use a pattern previously provided by our culture and duly recorded in our mind. For example, if you get a really hearty handshake from someone, you take that as a welcome, glad to meet you, really happy to make your acquaintance or to see you again. Well, that reaction is the pattern our culture has taught us to use to interpret the data when we observe or experience a set of behaviors. Okay? Now the problem arises when the person performing the handshake ritual is giving meaning to those sets of behaviors with a different cultural pattern. In other words, the 2 people don't have the same thing in their mind. They're not observing and understanding those sets of behaviors in the same way, and it's just almost amusing how far you can go astray if you participate in a culture and don't understand their patterns. Okay, 2 examples come to mind. The handshake exchange between a traditional Navajo and an Anglo-American is instructive. The Anglo reaches out, grabs the offered hand, pumps it vigorously up and down to show that he is friendly. And that's what's in his mind. That's the pattern that's animating his mind at the time. The Navajo person extends a hesitant and very soft handshake that the Anglos like to call the dead fish. The Anglo has no understanding or appreciation for what is in the Navajo person's mind, for the meaning of the pattern of the Navajo person uses to give meaning to the handshake, and that results in miscommunication. It says both people are taken aback by the ritual. The Anglo pattern patterns it as being unenthusiastic and unfriendly. The Navajo pattern, it is rude and pushy, perhaps more. Among the Navajo people, only close relatives are considered safe to be around. One should be very cautious with handshakes until one knows the person better, that they are not a witch who will try to harm you. Hence the cautious, tentative, these are Anglo words here, handshake. Another is the eyes during a conversation. Navajo people feel looking into someone's eyes while they are talking is very rude. Anglos speak of Navajo people as being shifty and unwilling to look you in the eye. Do you see how the two different patterns can miscommunicate if you aren't aware of them and can't account for them? Now, the same sets of behavior, the handshake ritual, the control of the eyes, they're the same, but two almost diametrically opposite patterns assign meaning to the participants in the two different cultures. Seeing only the sets, the small sequential behaviors that represent an action or a set of actions, including spoken words, and not understanding the pattern behind them leads to all sorts of miscommunication and misunderstanding. And when I was serving as a cross-cultural interpreter, as I mentioned before, one of my main jobs, I guess you would say, was to explain to one side or the other what the patterns were, say that the Anglos were using in what they were doing and saying, or in creating a program to be of service. Or I would be explaining to the Anglos what the Navajo people were thinking when they set up policies and procedures that seemed detrimental to what they should be doing, and so on. And it says this is complicated when the patterns being considered are formal. That is, everyone just assumes that everyone sees it this way, or informal, which just means that it's nonverbal. It's just something you picked up through observation, imitation, so on. You'll understand someday is what it says. They're difficult to quantify and make explicit. Only technical patterns lean toward being clear and unambiguous. And one of my main functions, even in doing what I'm doing right here, is to take this ambiguous set of cultural patterns that we're dealing with and make them clear and unambiguous, and give you the tools you need to pursue these things so that you can see them clearly in your mind and know how to act. So in capital letters in my notes, I said a big part of the study of culture is the study of patterns. Okay, it says sets are usually readily observable. Sets are usually readily observable. Patterns exist in the mind of the beholder. They are created, preserved, defended, and passed on by those who share the same view of the real world. As we have observed, the language we speak reflects and dictates this. It is one of our strongest windows on the world. However, you should know that there are at least 9 other things besides language that help to formulate culture. I won't drag you through them, but they're available and you ought to stick it in the back of your mind. Look at it sometime when you start wanting to dismantle the culture in a young person's mind because it's so inimical. You need to know what you have to deal with. It says, as I'm writing this, I'm really struggling to select examples, quotes, etc., and to write narrative that will help you perceive the reference. That is, a term will appear later in the lesson creation part of our study to perceive the referent means that you understand what I mean by what I say. And so it's very important that I reveal to you the pattern that I'm using to shape my words, my approach, and all of these things, to make it technical and explicit so that you can understand. Now, I quoted extensively from Chester Nez just for that reason. He offers a first-hand view of this, what it means to try to be in both cultures at the same time. I don't know any way to define these ideas and show the richness of their potential outside of using them to address problems we face in defining our own culture. This will be hard to do until the other models are also perceived. And that's what I've warned you all along, is complex problems we're faced with, and it requires complex solutions. And I've set aside these 8 knowledge domains to give you some tools to help you address this issue. And I don't know about you, but when I was doing some things like reading Hall, I just felt like the whole world was opening up for me, and I was understanding. And I made the mistake of thinking that I had all the answers, when in fact I only had part of the picture. So do your very best to go through this, examine all of the knowledge domains and the other material, and then begin to see what the implications are.
How many meat pies do you want tonight?
I'm suggesting that you pull up the free copy of Hall's book, The Silent Language, that I'm giving you a website where you can do that. I'm putting it into a thumbnail with this video, but you can also find it in the study guide on page 81. That says, like building blocks, we really need them all of these various things. So I'm going to define these things and push on to other material and come back to define and illustrate these principles, ideas in real-world situations. What I'm saying here is after we get through the knowledge domains, we can come back and we can say, like, create a unit called Put on the Whole Armor of God, and really get into what that means. Just really explain it well. And that will help draw all of this stuff together into an organized schemata to give you guidance in your work. Now, another aspect of Hall's culture, he has sets, isolates, and patterns. Under isolates, Hall defines these in some detail and uses them in a slightly different way than I have found practical, which is another way of saying I don't fully comprehend all this stuff. I just know what use I make of it. So prepare yourself to learn a great deal on your own. To me, an isolate is somewhat like the universals we looked at previously. Time, for example, is an isolate that can be running in the background of your mind. We can be doing almost anything and still be acutely aware of the passage of time. And some cultures divide time into much smaller parts than do others. They say that, the researchers say that the Mormon culture is more highly aware of the passage of small units of time than any other culture. I always get a kick out of we go to church, the 6 minutes before church is due to start, the chapel just fills up. Everybody's got it figured out. But anyway, on the other side, the other pattern is, if you're sick and you call for a Navajo medicine man to come and do a ceremony for you, and he only shows up 3 days late, he doesn't owe you any explanation at all. So The pattern is so important. It says, I hope I mentioned earlier that I have no intention of editing a Reader's Digest version of all the things I've discovered. I'm doing a survey of them to hopefully let you know what there is to be known and leaving you Google and thumb tracks that you can use to become your own expert in the field of the culture of godliness and to pursue your own areas of interest and concern in the process of helping yourself and others create a fully articulated human mind, and in the process, encouraging them to participate with you in the creation of the society of Enoch and Melchizedek, in other words, Zion. With that in mind, I'll give you some more examples of sets and patterns in an intercultural setting and then move on, but I remind you that these ideas apply to microanalysis between individuals, within families, as well, and much, much more. The good, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was what I called the good parent, bad parent conundrum. Says I had a client when I was a caseworker who was going to be picked up by the sheriff the next day and put in jail for failure to put his son in school. There was a big push in the county by the Anglos that every Navajo child needed to be in school. He came to me and asked me to go with him to talk to his boy. We put the Bronco in four-wheel drive and after some effort managed to chase the kid down in the sand dunes along the south side of the San Juan River where he was herding sheep. He was 10 or 11 years old. The father knew that he faced jail in the morning, but as he walked up to the boy, he said, "Do you want to go to school?" His son said, "No, I don't want to go to school." His father turned to me and said something like, "Well, you can see how it is. He doesn't want to go to school, so what can I do?" Fortunately for him, I could see how it is. It was the clash of two patterns, Navajo and Anglo, in the mind of the father. But it also represented the expectations of the two cultures in which he had to live. The Navajo language has no words for force and coercion. They don't allow for physical punishment, as Chester Nez taught us. A person's mind is respected and held inviolate, and to me, that's a remnant of this ZPD that I've been talking to you about, the zone of personal dominion, where our minds are locked up behind a barrier where nothing enters in, except we choose to have it enter in. And that's how we are able to exercise our free agency. Anyway, a person's mind is respected and held inviolate. The boy, according to this, should be free to choose his own path through life. If the father interfered with this, then among his own people he would be a bad parent. On the other hand, if he didn't do something, the Anglo law was going to punish him, perhaps take him away from his family to make an example of him. To the Anglo world, he would be a bad parent. Darned if you do, darned if you don't. This is a prime example of what Hall meant when he said, the Navajo and English languages are so different, they force the speaker into two separate views of reality. And oh, how they can clash within our minds. Now, going back to what Hall has said, culture is communication. Language is a major focus on which culture is built, but there are at least 9 others foci which are nonverbal. Language often reflects patterns from one or more of these, and we must be aware of this if we're going to be a good cross-cultural and intercultural interpreters. They're all covered in detail in Hall's book. Language often only represents in part of the other aspects, focuses, building blocks of culture. And we must understand this in order to use Hall's model in our quest for the culture of godliness. Now, we have a new way of thinking and talking about culture. Now we should probably stop using the word culture and use the word sets, isolates, patterns in our discussions. We want to learn technically and explicitly what the sets, isolates, and patterns of godliness are, as they are manifest in the 10 foci or building blocks of culture in their formal, informal, and technical manifestations. We may also be using elements of the first two models, material and non-material, and universal specialties and alternatives, to clarify our thinking. Alternatives are an especially important part of our study because our children, for example, may be learning, absorbing alternative behaviors and philosophy and social interaction ideas on an informal, largely unspoken, unexplained, out of awareness level without us or them even realizing it. And this is where peer pressure comes in a lot. This is what Hall has said: remember, by broadening his conception of the forces that make up and control his life, the average person can never again be completely caught in the grip of patterned behavior of which he has no awareness. And another thought I wanted to run past you is that a targeted intervention using all the tools we have discussed and the rest we've yet to cover to craft teachings that will help resolve these cultural challenges. And when we get into Feuerstein and how he resolved the need to help the Israeli citizens adapt to their country and their culture and so on, I think you'll begin to see that we have no reason to really be too concerned about the outcome of things because we have such rich resources to use in going about our interventions and responding to the acultural, anti-Christ dogmas that are out there and creating so much heartache and confusion.